We sold the estate, she whispered. I smiled and opened the ledger. My name is Evelyn Vance. And I am 32 years old. 3 days before my grandfather's will was scheduled to be read at his own funeral, my older sister Clara leaned across the casket's elaborate display of white lilies and whispered 12 words into my ear. We've already decided what to do with his estate. Don't embarrass yourself. I did not flinch or cry, and simply nodded once, maintaining the neutral expression I had spent a lifetime perfecting. I smiled, a small polite curvature of the lips, and told her the simple, devastating truth that I had decided to, alongside the federal lawyer my grandfather and I had hired back in October. Clara's face went still, the arrogant gleam in her eyes flickered, replaced for a fraction of a second by a profound, chilling uncertainty. She had been counting on the tired, quiet little sister who always signed wherever she was pointed, the obedient scapegoat who handled the paperwork and faded into the wallpaper. But my grandfather, Arthur Vance, had been counting on something else entirely. He had seen this exact betrayal coming for years, and he had sealed his ultimate answer inside one heavy, cream-colored envelope locked in a vault in downtown Chicago. 48 hours later, in a sterile, glass-walled legal office on the 42nd floor, my sister and her husband would learn how terribly they had misjudged me. But the quiet, unrecorded October that none of them had bothered to notice has to come first. Welcome back to Quiet Strength Stories, where dignity outlasts cruelty, and the people everyone underestimates get the last quiet word. If a story here reminds you of someone you love, that is the point. Drop a comment, tell me where you are listening from, and subscribe so the next one finds you. The morning the specialist at Northwestern Memorial looked at my grandfather and said the word terminal, Arthur Vance did not blink. He thanked the doctor in his gravelly, measured voice, and shook the man's hand with a grip that had built a logistics empire from the ground up. Then he walked out to the parking garage, got into the passenger seat of my car, and looked at me. We had been a team, just the two of us against the world, since my parents passed away when I was 10. People in the industry thought of us as a matched set. Arthur had the vision. He could look at a map of supply chains and see inefficiencies in 3 seconds flat. I had the precision. I could look at a 50-page forensic audit and find a buried offshore account in 2. How long? I asked him, keeping my hands steady on the steering wheel. Long enough, he said, staring out at the gray Chicago skyline. He never cried, not once on that entire drive back to his estate. Instead, he started planning. Most people would assume he meant the practical, morbid planning of a dying man, the burial plot, the headstone, the hymns he wanted sung. But Arthur was a tactician. He spent that first week at his heavy mahogany desk with a yellow legal pad, writing lists I was explicitly forbidden to see. When I would bring him his tea, he would slide his arm over the page, gentle but firm. Mind your own ledgers, Evie, he would say with a faint, knowing smile. I let him have his secrets. After 22 years of being his right hand, you learn which doors to leave shut. I genuinely believed his lists were about tying up loose ends, getting his conscience straight before the end. I did not realize they were about the vultures. They were about the people who could not wait for his heart to stop beating. I should have looked harder at that yellow pad and did not. I was too busy being his caretaker, counting the precious weeks the doctors had given us, missing the quiet, lethal machine my grandfather had already begun to build, one careful page at a time. Let me tell you about Vance Logistics in the South Loop Commercial Complex, because that complex is the entire story. The Vance South Loop Hub sits on 14 acres of prime downtown real estate. 400 people work there. Last year, the subsidiary technology division alone cleared a little over $600 million in proprietary supply chain software and automated warehousing contracts. It is the kind of generational wealth that outlives the man who built it, the kind of money that turns families into venomous strangers. Every piece of software that leaves our servers carries a small, hidden digital signature. 2 letters, A and E, Arthur's mark and mine. By the front entrance of the main glass atrium, there is a brushed steel plaque I had commissioned in 2018. Advanced Tech and Logistics E. And A. Vance founded 2018 E before AI, put it that way on purpose at his insistence. Nobody in the family ever noticed. Clara noticed it least of all. She had walked past that plaque in her designer heels maybe twice a year, usually when she needed to extract from for our grandfather. To her, it was just cold metal beside a heavy door. She called the place Grandpa's little warehouse. So did her husband, so did the board members who didn't know any better. I let them for years. I let every single soul in our toxic extended family believe my grandfather solely owned what we had built together. It was easier that way. It kept the peace. It made Arthur proud to be the face of the legacy, and I preferred the shadows. I never minded standing behind him and had built the standing behind myself, line of code by line of code, ledger by ledger, the same as the steel girders holding up the roof. But a brushed steel plaque does not lie, it just waits for somebody to read it. 3 days after the funeral, in a high-rise lawyer's office, somebody finally would, and the reading of it would suck the oxygen right out of the room. I should explain how a girl who was treated as the family's invisible errand runner ended up owning a $600 million technology empire. Back in 2015, Arthur had the industry connections and the operational brilliance. But he did not have a head for modern financial technology, and he knew it. I had just finished my master's in forensic accounting and cybersecurity, and was working for an elite federal auditing firm, tracking dark money for 3 years. When Arthur wanted to modernize, we pooled our resources. He brought the logistics framework, I brought my federal-level encryption protocols and a clean financial record. I am the one who filed the LLC, I signed the articles of organization. I structured the ownership the way the top-tier corporate attorneys advised, creating a digital fortress to protect the assets if a competitor ever tried a hostile takeover. In 2018, when we bought the 14 acres in the South Loop out of a complex foreclosure, I put the deed in my name. It was not done in secret, the county clerk recorded it downtown like any other commercial deed. It is a matter of public record, anyone could pull it for a nominal fee, nobody ever did. I ran the proprietary contracts and handled the international banking regulations. I sat across from every aggressive supplier who tried to squeeze us, and I did not blink. Arthur built the physical empire, I built the digital ghost that made it invincible. None of this was hidden, it was simply unread. The way arrogant people never bother to read the label on a bottle they have been pouring from their whole lives. Paperwork was my native language. Most days it sat quiet in encrypted servers and gray filing cabinets, dull as dust to the untrained eye, and I was genuinely glad to leave it there. But there would come a Tuesday in November when those encrypted files were the only things in the world that could speak for me. And when they spoke, the whole family would finally have to listen. Let me introduce you to Clara. My older sister married Marcus 11 years ago in an obscenely expensive country club wedding that Arthur paid for. Clara is 38, sharp, manicured, and exhausted in a way that stems from constantly trying to project a wealth she does not actually possess. She talks about optics and legacy the way some people talk about breathing constantly, and with a low, desperate dread running underneath every enunciated syllable. I understood that dread to a. After our parents died, Clara dealt with the grief by attaching herself to status. She needed to be seen, to be validated by price tags and exclusive invitations. I dealt with the grief by learning how the world actually worked, by understanding the silent mechanics of power and money. Marcus is 42, an investment banker whose bank never quite seems to make any actual investments. He is soft where my grandfather was solid, wearing tailored suits that mask a profound professional incompetence. Clara and Marcus grew up, and subsequently built their marriage, on the absolute certainty that Arthur's logistics company was their birthright. The way a spoiled child is certain the sun rises exclusively for them. That spring before the diagnosis, Clara began deploying one particular phrase at our tense, monthly Sunday dinners. "Evie, you've really earned a rest," she would tell me, patting my hand with painted acrylic nails. "You've spent your whole 20s playing Grandpa's little assistant. Let Marcus and his team carry the operational load now. It's time for the adults to handle the heavy lifting." It sounded sweet to an outsider, it sounded like sibling care. It was in fact the most polite, condescending way anyone has ever told me to disappear and forfeit my life's work. I would smile past the roasted asparagus and say nothing, and have learned through years of forensic audits that a sweet knife is still a knife. I just did not yet know how soon she planned to use it or how deep she intended to cut. October is when the quiet, unobserved shifts started. Arthur was still himself then, clear-eyed, walking on his own, losing a bit of weight but not yet the frail shadow the cancer would eventually make of him. 3 or 4 times that month he would take his black sedan into the city and come back hours later with nothing in his hands and a look on his face I could not quite place. Once I found a thick cream-colored envelope on his study desk. Heavy archival stock, the kind that costs significant money and usually involves federal watermarks. I picked it up, it had no name on it. "That's mine," from the doorway, his voice low but not unkind. I set it down immediately. By supper it had vanished. "Arthur," I said, pouring him his black coffee, "what are you doing out there in the city?" He took his time stirring the coffee and looked at me, his eyes sharp and unclouded. "I took care of the administrative architecture," he said. When Ruth calls, you listen to her, you listen to all of it before you say one single word. I had never heard the name Ruth in my life. Who is Ruth? Somebody who works for us now, he said. And that was the absolute end of the discussion. I assumed he meant the life insurance policies, the burial arrangements, the beneficiary forms, the dull necessary business of a man preparing for the end, and even felt a slight pang of hurt that he had navigated it without me, after 22 years of me handling every piece of our paperwork. So I let it go and had precious weeks to count, a grandfather to keep comfortable, and 100 small medical mercies to manage every single day. I was wrong about the insurance and was profoundly wrong about a great many things that October. And the cream-colored envelope I had set back down on his desk would not surface again until it was the only weapon left that could save me from complete ruin. By early November, the cancer had sunk its claws into him. He could not manage the stairs of the estate and slept far more than he woke. The tech division and the logistics hubs ran without him, and for the first time in nearly a decade, they ran largely without me too, because I would not leave his bedside for anything, and managed the servers remotely, working at 3 a.m. while listening to the rhythmic hum of his oxygen machine. That is when Clara decided to make herself useful. She swept into the estate like a conquering general and set up a color-coded calendar on the kitchen refrigerator. Visiting and estate management hours, she called it. She managed who came and went, ostensibly so Grandpa can rest. In reality, she was managing me right along with everyone else, systematically isolating Arthur. "You look exhausted, Evie," she would say, steering me toward the guest wing with a firm hand on my shoulder. "Go lie down, Marcus and I have him. We're handling the paperwork today anyway." Carol noticed it before I comprehended the threat. Carol Tennant was our private hospice nurse, 58 years old, 30 years in end-of-life care, with sharp intuitive eyes that did not miss a single micro-expression. She began to linger after her shifts and began asking me small, careful, probing questions about who was in the house, when they arrived, and what they carried with them. One bleak, rainy afternoon, I walked softly up the main hall and heard Clara's voice through the cracked bedroom door. "He needs quiet, Evie, not your endless spreadsheets," Clara had told me earlier. But now she was the one talking. I stopped. I did not go in and stood in the shadowed hallway and listened. "Just sign here, Grandpa," Clara was saying, her voice sickeningly sweet, the kind of voice you use to coax a toddler. Marcus drew it up. "It just simplifies everything so Evie doesn't have to stress about the warehouses anymore. You know she can't handle the big decisions." I stepped back from the door, and I want to be clear about my reasons, and could have stormed in. I could have torn the paper from her hands, but I would not turn my grandfather's final, painful weeks a screaming war zone. That was a calculated decision I made with my eyes wide open. It cost me more emotional restraint than I can possibly articulate, and given the chance, I would make it again, but stepping back is not the same thing as giving up. Stepping back is merely gaining a wider field of vision. I went to my room, lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Down the hall, behind a door I had agreed not to open, my sister was carrying in the fraudulent paper she planned to bury me with. Arthur died on a Thursday just after 6 in the morning. I was sitting beside him, holding his hand. The room was washed in the cold gray light of early dawn, and it was terribly, beautifully quiet. I will not dress it up for the sake of poetry. He was there, a force of nature, and then he was gone. And the massive estate grew suddenly bigger, emptier, and colder in the space of a single breath. I allowed myself 1 hour of pure, unfiltered grief and cried until my teeth. Then I washed my face, smoothed my hair, and the silent forensic machine I had built in my mind began to turn. By noon, Clara was pacing in the main study, speaking in hushed, urgent tones on her cell phone. By the next morning, she and Marcus were speaking about the estate in the past tense, the way you speak about a transaction that is already settled, signed, and delivered. Marcus would not quite meet my eyes when he passed me in the kitchen. There was a paper I gathered from their smug micro-expressions. Something Arthur had signed. They mentioned it the way amateur card players whisper about an ace they are clumsily holding under the table. The funeral was set for Saturday. The official will reading, according to a stiff call from a law office I didn't recognize, would be the following Tuesday. The night before we buried him, Carol, the hospice nurse, caught me alone in the library. She had come by under the guise of dropping off medical records. "Evelyn," she said quietly, her eyes darting toward the hallway. "There is something you need to know about the night they had him sign that document." "I waited," I replied, keeping my voice level. "Not here," she said, glancing toward the grand staircase where Marcus's footsteps were echoing. After the service tomorrow, you will want to hear all of it, start to finish, 3 days to the will reading. 3 days for a toxic family to mentally spend money they did not have on a tech empire they did not own, built by a sister they did not respect. But first we had to bury him, and first at the front of a crowded opulent cathedral. My sister had something she simply could not wait to whisper in my ear. We buried Arthur Vance on a bright, bitterly cold Saturday in Chicago. The cathedral was packed. 40 years of dominating the Midwest logistics industry fills a very large room. There were politicians, rival CEOs, floor managers from the warehouses, and half the city's financial sector. I stood at the very front beside the casket wearing a tailored black coat, composed. Clara sidled up next to me to pay her respects. This meant positioning herself where the most important people in the room could photograph her grieving. The lilies smelled suffocatingly sweet, masking the sterile scent of the cathedral. She leaned in close, her designer perfume clashing with the flowers, her face expertly arranged for the crowd into a mask of soft, tragic sorrow. "We've already decided what happens to his estate," she whispered. "Don't embarrass yourself on Tuesday, we'll make sure you get a small allowance." It was quiet enough that only I heard it, spoken over our grandfather's body, and have been underestimated my entire life. I have learned through years of corporate warfare not to argue with an idiot in the moment they feel most victorious. So I did not argue or glare, and nodded once I smiled, the small, polite, chilling smile I had worn across negotiating tables when I was about to ruin a corrupt supplier. Then I told her the absolute truth. "So have I whispered back. "With the federal lawyer he hired in October." I watched the words land. It was instantaneous, her face, so constructed for the cameras, fractured at the corner of her mouth. The panic hit her eyes first, then her jaw tightened. She had not known there was a lawyer and had not known about October. She had been certain she was whispering her victory to a beaten, submissive woman. "What lawyer?" she hissed, her mask slipping. It was not a question, it was a small, dry sound, the sound of a flawless plan developing a microscopic, fatal crack. The organ music swelled, the bishop raised his hands to speak. I turned my attention back to the casket, leaving her standing there amidst the crushed lilies, drowning in the very first wave of real, visceral fear she had felt all week. The will would be read in 3 days. She had that long to lie awake and wonder what her dead grandfather had done to her in the daylight. After the burial service, the reception was held at a private club downtown. The room buzzed with the low hum of old money and high-stakes gossip. Aunt Margaret, Arthur's bitter younger sister, found her audience by the champagne fountain. Margaret is 65, a woman who has spent her entire life furious that she wasn't born a man in a patriarchal business family. She loved Arthur, but she loved money more, and she had been listening to Clara for weeks. Clara had been exceptionally busy poisoning the well. "It's a shame, really," Margaret said, her voice carrying enough to reach a circle of cousins and minor shareholders. "Evelyn is just, well, she's an assistant. The logistics empire needs real leadership. It needs to go to Marcus and Clara, someone with business acumen." A few heads turned toward me. I was standing 10 feet away holding a crystal glass of sparkling water I had no intention of drinking, watching them with the detached fascination of a biologist observing single-celled organisms. "Family takes care of family, Evelyn," Margaret said, turning to face me now, emboldened by the champagne. "You understand that, don't you? You'll do the right thing by Clara and Marcus. You'll step aside smoothly." The room grew noticeably quieter. This is how corporate assassinations are conducted in polite society, not with shouting, but with a sentence set down gently in front of witnesses, creating a social pressure cooker with nowhere to vent. I could have told her about the deed, and could have told her about the 2018 LLC restructuring. I could have told her about the encryption keys in my pocket that controlled $600 million in software revenue. And did not. I took a small sip of my water. "I am certain we will all do the right thing," I said, my voice smooth as glass. Arthur usually saw to that. Margaret blinked, unsure of what to do with a calm, unbothered answer. She had come armed for a hysterical fight, and a fight requires 2 participants. I simply refused to engage and let her keep her weapon holstered. Silence is a devastatingly effective answer too, and mine was the only one that would still be standing on Tuesday. So, I let the entire reception hall believe for a few more days that they were watching a quiet, naive girl lose everything she had ever worked for. With Open User 1H4, Revenge Girl 1A2 Translations, EO1 Funfiv HQ8XTVZ4. MD encoding UF8 as FF. The fraudulent document surfaced 2 days before the official reading, right inside my own kitchen. I was at the Marble Island reviewing a complex server migration report on my encrypted tablet, when Clara and Marcus walked in. They did not knock and had already begun treating the estate as if they held the master keys. Marcus was carrying a leather folio, the kind men carry when they want to appear more important than they actually are. Clara flanked him, her posture rigid with poorly concealed excitement. "We didn't want this to be a surprise on Tuesday, Evie," Clara said, sliding the folio across the cool marble toward my tablet. Grandpa made his final wishes clear before he passed. I did not close my tablet or look up immediately and let them stand there for 10 agonizing seconds, forcing them to wait on my attention. Finally, I tapped the screen to lock it, slowly looked up and opened the folio. Inside was a single freshly typed page, Last Will and Testament of Arthur Vance. It read at the top, printed in a generic default font. Below that were 4 brief paragraphs essentially liquidating the tech division, transferring full executive control of Vance Logistics to Marcus, and leaving the 14-acre South Loop estate to Clara. At the very bottom was Arthur's signature. It was jagged, weak, and barely legible, tracing the frantic, uncoordinated tremors of a man medicated on morphine. Below his signature were 2 witness lines. One bore Clara's looping, arrogant signature. The other bore Marcus's sharp scrawl. I read the document twice and kept my face neutral. I did not betray a single emotion and have signed hundreds of international corporate contracts in the last decade. I have caught microscopic accounting errors that saved this family millions of dollars in tax liability. Money that Clara spent on summer homes and Marcus lost in the market. And knew before I even finished the first ridiculous paragraph how legally shattered this piece of paper was. But a woman who reveals her hand at the kitchen table is a strategic fool. "That is certainly Arthur's signature," I said quietly, telling the absolute truth. Clara relaxed her shoulders, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "So you understand it's settled then. We want to transition the operation smoothly. No need for you to worry about the heavy lifting anymore." "I understand that and signed," I replied, sliding the leather folio back across the marble toward her. Marcus smirked, leaning against the counter like a man who had already mentally spent the liquidation money. I stood up, gathered my coffee cup and walked to the sink and washed it deliberately. My back turned to them. I said nothing about the fact that they were the sole witnesses, and said nothing about what federal probate law dictates regarding a will signed over to the exact 2 people who literally held the dying man's hand to the page. That part was reserved exclusively for Tuesday. That part was for a sterile room with a federal lawyer present, and a brushed steel plaque's worth of truth currently resting in a cream-colored envelope they had no idea existed. "We'll see you Tuesday, Evie," Clara said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Try to pack your personal things from the office before then. We're bringing in a new design team for the executive suite." They left genuinely believing they had tightened a psychological screw. They had no idea they were merely winding their own execution clock. Every step they took toward the door was one tick closer to a room where dates and signatures dictate reality, and where a soft, unbothered voice does not need to raise a single decibel to destroy them. Once the front door clicked shut, I sat back down at the island and unlocked my tablet. And was not just a grieving granddaughter, I was a forensic auditor. And it was time to follow the money. The discovery regarding Marcus's true financial state had actually begun the previous Monday, purely by accident. I was running a routine dark web scan on our corporate network vulnerability standard protocol for a tech firm handling $600 million in revenue, when my algorithms flagged a massive, anomalous credit inquiry against the Vance Logistics primary operating accounts, and had bypassed the standard banking portals and accessed the deep-tier financial routing. What I found was a disaster hidden behind Marcus's tailored suits. Marcus was the managing partner of a boutique investment firm, Crestview Capital. But Crestview was not investing, it was bleeding. It was a glorified Ponzi scheme running on fumes and desperate mezzanine loans. 3 weeks prior, in late September, Marcus had taken out a massive illegal shadow loan. $4.8 million. He didn't borrow it from a standard commercial bank. Standard banks require collateral he didn't have. He borrowed it from a syndicate of high-risk predatory private equity lenders. The kind of lenders who do not send polite letters when you miss a payment, they simply seize assets and ruin lives. And the collateral Marcus had listed: the Vance Logistics South Loop estate. He had forged the preliminary corporate authorizations, assuming that once Arthur died, the fake will would grant him executive control in time to legitimize the collateral, and had convinced Clara to co-sign the catastrophic note. Both of their names were legally bound to $4.8 million of predatory debt. The mechanism of their greed suddenly snapped into perfect clarity. They had not just wanted the inheritance out of vanity, they had already illegally borrowed against it out of sheer terror. Marcus needed executive control of the tech division so there would be something solid standing behind that forged note. Clara needed the status of the estate to maintain her illusion of wealth. And they both needed me to disappear so I wouldn't audit the books and find the crater they had dug. The $4.8 million was a ticking time bomb and the timer was running out. That evening I called Carol, the hospice nurse. It was time to verify the final piece of the puzzle. She arrived at the estate an hour later carrying a folder of medical logs rather than the usual sympathy casserole. We sat in the cavernous, dimly lit library, the heavy oak doors shut tight against the empty house. "Tell me about the night they had him sign that paper," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Carol sat straight in her chair, her professional demeanor giving way to a cold, righteous anger. "It was the second week of November," she began, her eyes locked on mine. "Late, after 11 at night, you had been up for 48 hours straight migrating those servers. Clara had practically forced you to go to the guest wing to sleep. She handed you a sleeping pill, Evie." I nodded slowly. I remembered the exhaustion, the heavy, unnatural sleep that had pulled me under. "They came into the room," Carol continued. "Clara and Marcus. Clara asked me to step out. She said it was private family business. I refused. I told her I was his primary medical caregiver and I would be staying right there. So Marcus tried to physically intimidate me. He stood over me, blocking the door while Clara went to the bed." "How was Arthur?" I asked, my chest tightening despite my rigid control. Carol's jaw clenched. "He was medicated and was drifting in and out of lucidity. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't hold the glass of water, let alone a pen. He did not have a steady hand and he certainly did not have a steady mind." She leaned forward, her voice dropping an octave. "They put the pen in his hand." Evie. Clara physically guided his fingers across the paper. "And the entire time Arthur kept asking for you over and over. Where's Evie? Get Evie, let Evie read it." A cold, diamond-hard resolve settled into my bones. Not a fiery, blinding rage, but something infinitely colder, sharper, and far more lethal. "And what did Clara tell him?" I asked. "She lied to his face," Carol's, her voice shaking with suppressed fury. "I heard it clear. She stroked his hair and told him you had already approved it, and told him you had gone home to your apartment in the city, because you were too busy with your own work to sit with him." The silence in the library was absolute. I let the weight of that betrayal settle over the room. Clara had not only forged a legal document, she had weaponized my grandfather's dying moments, attempting to convince him that his loyal granddaughter had abandoned him for a spreadsheet. "Would you be willing to say that on Tuesday?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. "In front of the federal lawyer? In front of Marcus? In front of the entire family they've invited?" Carol didn't hesitate. She set her folder down on the mahogany table. "Evelyn," she said fiercely, "I have been waiting for 3 agonizing weeks for somebody in this family to finally ask me that question." The following morning, Monday, I drove into downtown Chicago to meet Ruth Avery in person. Her office was not a flashy, glass-paneled suite in a skyscraper, but a discreet, secured floor in a historic building near the federal courthouse. Ruth was 72, sharp as a scalpel, dressed in an immaculate gray suit, and possessed the kind of aura that made powerful men instinctively lower their voices. We understood each other within 60 seconds. We were women who had spent our entire professional lives reading the fine print that arrogant men signed without bothering to comprehend. She poured 2 cups of black coffee and laid the legal architecture out for me with brutal precision. "Your grandfather's October will contains an irrevocable revocation clause," Ruth said. Her voice steady and exact. "It legally vaporizes every prior will, every subsequent informal document, and any holographic attempts at estate modification. He signed it while lucid, backed by a clean psychiatric evaluation I ordered that very morning, and signed it in this room before 2 independent federal witnesses, my senior paralegal and a federally bonded notary." She took a sip of her coffee. "It is legally impenetrable, and their paper, the bedside tragedy they concocted, is a joke." Ruth almost smiled, a predatory glint in her eye. "A will physically guided by the 2 people who inherit from it, while the signatory is documented to be on heavy narcotics. In the state of Illinois, that is the literal textbook definition of extreme undue influence and elder fraud. It revokes nothing, it barely qualifies as scrap paper." She did not physically show me the sealed letter. It remained locked in a biometric safe behind her desk, resting next to the cream-colored envelope Arthur had touched in October. "He was specific about the letter," Ruth noted, catching my gaze lingering on the safe. Everyone in the room hears it or no one does. You let them talk and let them present their fraudulent document. You let them get comfortable on their makeshift throne. And then we pull the floor out from under them and the LLC structure. I ask soft, the tech division in the land, Ruth said, her eyes gleaming with professional satisfaction, is the part they understand least of all. They think they are fighting over an inheritance and have no idea they are trying to steal a company you already own. She stood up and walked me to the heavy oak doors of her office. Sit in the very back tomorrow, Evelyn. Let Clara perform, let Marcus gloat, let them dig the hole as deep as they possibly can. Then we bury them in it. I went down to the bustling Chicago streets. It was an ordinary Monday. Except for the fact that 12 people were about to gather the next morning and find out who I had been for the last decade, and was not the only one preparing. Clara had spent the entire weekend conducting a masterclass in premature victory. She had called the extended family and had called 3 of the logistics floor managers. She had called Aunt Margaret, who needed zero encouragement to spread the gossip. Clara treated the upcoming Tuesday reading not as a legal proceeding but as a coronation. She had invited relatives specifically to support the new leadership. She had purchased a new expensive navy blue designer dress for the occasion, and had booked a blowout at a premium salon. One of the younger cousins, a decent kid named Peter who worked in the IT department, texted me on Monday night. He told me what Clara had said when someone mentioned the brushed steel plaque by the front door, the one that read E. and A. Vance. Oh, that old piece of metal. Clara had laughed, sipping her third mimosa at Sunday brunch. Grandpa just put Evelyn's name on it to be sweet. You know how he was. He always felt sorry for her because she doesn't have a real social life. It was just a vanity project to make the assistant feel important. To be sweet, 22 years of forensic accounting, hundreds of millions of dollars in secured federal contracts. The flawless restructuring of an international logistics network. The silent acquisition of 14 acres of prime downtown real estate. And Clara had arrogantly folded every ounce of my blood, sweat, and genius down into a grandfather being sweet to his pathetic little assistant. She had no idea that the steel plaque was the single most brutally honest object in this entire narrative. That it had been screaming the plain, unvarnished truth out in the open since 2018. That was the fatal flaw in Clara's psychology. She was so toxically certain of her own manufactured superiority that she never once bothered to read the room she was standing in. People who are certain stop checking the perimeter. And a person who stops checking the perimeter will walk straight into a landmine they helped to arm. Clara was going to walk into that lawyer's office on Tuesday morning at the very front of the pack, smiling, ready to be crowned queens in front of everyone she had invited to witness her triumph. I would come in last and would sit in the back, and I would wait. Before we step into that boardroom, let me clarify one vital point. The documents Arthur signed in October were never about the money. $600 million, a 14-acre estate, an international logistics hub. He could have fought them over all of that while he was still alive. He had the money to crush them in court and never did. What he signed in October was about respect. It was about a woman the entire family had quietly, universally agreed to overlook and underestimate. It was about proving that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the most powerful. If anyone has ever told you that being patient makes you a doormat or that silence is synonymous with weakness, stay for this final act. Subscribe, pour yourself a drink, and let us finish this together. Tuesday, 10 o'clock in the morning, the grand conference room of Avery & Associates. I wore a tailored charcoal gray designer suit, the kind that does not feature visible logos but costs more than Clara's entire curated wardrobe. On my wrist, I wore Arthur's vintage silver Patek Philippe, the band adjusted to fit me, and carried a sleek black leather portfolio. The sealed letter had been locked in Ruth's safe since October. Arthur had carried it to her himself on the exact same day I had seen the cream-colored envelope resting on his study desk. All my portfolio held now was a blank legal pad and a single silver pen. I didn't need notes. I had memorized the financial architecture of the entire empire years ago. Carol, the hospice nurse, walked into the building with me. She took a seat in a leather chair by the far wall, her posture rigid, her eyes sharp. 14 of us filled the expansive mahogany-paneled room. Clara and Marcus sat at the very front, occupying the plush executive chairs opposite Ruth Avery's massive desk. Clara was practically vibrating with anticipation. Marcus sat beside her, bouncing one knee nervously, the physical manifestation of a man who owes $4.8 million to dangerous people and needs the next 30 minutes to go as he planned. Aunt Margaret sat near them, flanked by 3 cousins who had been promised vague, lucrative positions in the new management structure. 2 of the senior logistics floor managers were there, looking uncomfortable in their ill-fitting suits. They had worked for me for 5 years, taking my encrypted directives and operational blueprints, but they did not yet know that the corporate management they reported to was just me, sitting in a guest bedroom with a laptop. Ruth Avery sat behind her desk. In front of her lay 2 immaculate manila folders, and resting squarely between them, positioned where every single person in the room could see it, was one heavy cream-colored envelope. It sat there like a locked vault that nobody else possessed the combination to. I took the chair in the very back, in the corner beside the heavy oak door. Clara turned around and glanced at me. She took in my quiet demeanor, the blank portfolio on my lap, and she offered a condescending, pitying smile. To her, I was just the grieving, helpless widow equivalent, clinging to a blank notepad because I had nothing else left. "You can come sit up front, Evie," Clara said, her voice dripping with toxic performative generosity for the benefit of the cousins. "There's an empty chair right behind Marcus. We're family, we're going to take care of you." "I am fine right here, Clara," I replied, my voice smooth and resonant. "I prefer to see the whole room, and always have. You see a lot more from the back," I added, locking eyes with Marcus. "You see who looks at whom and see who is sweating. You see who has already spent millions of dollars that was never theirs to begin with." Marcus's bouncing knee suddenly stopped. He swallowed hard. Clara frowned, the first tiny fracture appearing in her bulletproof confidence. But she recovered, turning her back to me, raising her chin and preparing to receive her crown. She had explicitly chosen the front row. It was fitting, I thought, as I rested my hands on my portfolio. She would be the very first one the explosion hit when the blast wave crossed the room. Ruth Avery folded her hands on her desk and surveyed the room over the top of her wire-rimmed glasses. "Thank you all for being here," Ruth began, her voice commanding instant, absolute silence. "We are gathered today to formally read the final will and testament of Arthur James Vance." Before Ruth could open the first folder, Clara stood up. She couldn't help herself. The spotlight was a drug she had been addicted to her entire life. "Actually, Ruth, before you begin," Clara interrupted, her voice loud and confident. She walked her single-typed page up to the massive desk and placed it down like a royal decree. "My grandfather made his final, most urgent wishes very clear before he passed. He wanted to keep the transition simple and within the immediate family." She turned so the entire room could hear her. "This document is signed by Arthur, and it is legally witnessed. The tech division, the logistics network, and executive control go to Marcus. The South Loop estate remains with me. I think reading this will save us all a great deal of unnecessary time and corporate heartache." Aunt Margaret nodded vigorously from the front row. "That's right, family handles family business." Marcus leaned back in his chair, trying to project the relaxed aura of a CEO, though the sweat on his upper lip betrayed him. Ruth Avery did not flinch. She looked down at the type page for 3 seconds and did not physically touch it. "Thank you, Clara," Ruth said. Her tone was flat, utterly unimpressed, the exact tone a seasoned professor uses when a freshman hands in a plagiarized essay. "I will address that particular piece of paper in a moment. Please return to your seat." Something in Ruth's delivery, the absolute lack of deference, the dismissal of Clara's grand moment, sent a shockwave of unease through the front row. Clara sat down slowly, her manicured hands tightening into fists. Ruth deliberately opened the first manila folder. Then she opened the second. She left the cream-colored envelope sitting where it was. "Let us begin," Ruth announced, her voice echoing in the silent room, "with the last will and testament that Arthur Vance executed in this very office on October the 14th. Ruth began to read. She read in a clear, measured, devastatingly precise voice and read the date. She read Arthur's full legal name and read the clause that legally named the sole executor of the entire multi-million-dollar estate. Evelyn Vance. Then Ruth reached a critical clause. She intentionally slowed her cadence down, enunciating every single syllable so that not one person in the room could ever claim they had misunderstood. "I hereby and irrevocably revoke all prior wills, all codicils, and any and all other documents, formal or informal, purporting to direct the disposition of my estate or corporate assets." Ruth looked up over her glasses, sweeping her gaze across Marcus and Clara. "Signed on October the 14th, witnessed by a federally bonded notary public, and by my senior paralegal, neither of whom stands to inherit a single dollar from this man." The room was paralyzed. The silence was absolute. I spoke then from the very back of the room, and did not stand up or raise my voice a single fraction of an inch. I used the exact same polite, chilling tone I had used at the cathedral. We've both decided, Clara, I said, letting the words hang in the air. But his decision is dated October. Clara's head snapped back to the front, the expensive navy dress, the $300 salon blowout, the grand coronation she had invited half the family to witness, the entire elaborate fantasy shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces all at once. That is not right. Clara stammered, her voice shrill and panicked. She pointed a shaking finger at the typed page on the desk. He signed ours in November. After that one, everyone knows that the most recent document supersedes the older one. Ours is the legal will. We will arrive at your November document momentarily, Ruth said, her tone as cold as liquid nitrogen. A later document wins. Clara's voice climbed an entire octave, the sophisticated socialite facade melting away to reveal the desperate, greedy panic underneath. Marcus's lawyer said the most recent signature wins. Ruth's voice cracked like a whip. Sit down, and I will explain to you what a later piece of paper has to be before it counts for anything in the state of Illinois. You are going to want to listen to this part very, very carefully. Clara collapsed into her chair as if her knees had been kicked out from under her. Marcus had gone the color of wet ash. Here is the law, Ruth stated, speaking brutal English. She picked up the type page Clara had brought in and held it by the extreme top corner, the way a detective holds a contaminated piece of evidence. This page was signed in November, that much is technically true, but a will only carries legal weight if the individual signing it comprehended it, chose it freely, and crucially if the individuals witnessing the signature do not stand to financially gain from the document. Ruth read the names off the bottom of the page, her voice dripping with professional disdain. This document has two witnesses, Clara Vance, Marcus Vance, the exact two people it supposedly enriches. Ruth dropped the paper back onto the desk. It landed with a soft, pathetic slap. A dying man, medicated on Schedule II narcotics, witnessed exclusively by the two people attempting to seize his company. Ruth continued. In a federal probate court, a document like this does not survive 3 minutes of scrutiny. It fails on mental capacity, it fails on extreme undue influence, it revokes nothing. The October will is the sole controlling document of this estate. He wanted us to have it, Clara screamed, losing her composure. He told us he wanted Marcus to run the tech division. Did he? It was not a question, it was a trap snapping shut. I spoke again, still seated in the back, my voice cutting through Clara's hysteria like a scalpel. He hired a federal lawyer in October, Clara, I said. You forced a typed page under his shaking hand in the dark. While he was drugged, while you physically blocked his medical staff from intervening. The room gasped. Aunt Margaret looked horrified. Peter, the IT cousin, stared down at his shoes. Clara whipped around. You're lying. You weren't even there. You went back to your apartment because you didn't care about him. That was the cue. Carol stood up from her chair by the wall. She smoothed her cardigan and faced the room, a pillar of absolute, unshakable integrity. I am a licensed medical professional and I was his primary hospice nurse, Carol said, her voice ringing out clear and strong. I was there the night they forced him to sign that piece of paper. They physically blocked me from the room. Arthur was medicated, he was hallucinating, and kept asking for his granddaughter, Evelyn, over and over again. Carol looked into Clara's terrified eyes. They lied to him and told him Evelyn had gone home. But Evelyn was asleep down the hall in the guest wing. She had been awake for 2 days straight working on the company servers to keep the logistics network running while Arthur was dying, and was right down the hall. I am prepared to testify to every single word of this under oath in a federal court. Nobody in the room made a sound. You could hear the distant traffic of downtown Chicago 40 stories below. Ruth let the absolute devastation of that revelation sit in the room for a long, torturous moment. Then she reached over and picked up the heavy, cream-colored envelope. Mr. Vance, Ruth said, her voice softening just a fraction, left a personal letter. He explicitly instructed me to read it aloud. Ruth sliced the envelope open with a silver letter opener. Heath wrote this on the signed the October will, Ruth explained. He demanded that it be read in full with everyone present. These are Arthur's words, not mine. She unfolded the thick archival paper and began to read. If you are sitting in this room hearing this, then I am gone. And the people I am unfortunately related to are currently sitting in a circle, attempting to steal what was never theirs to take. I am profoundly sorry, Evie, Ruth read. I should have stopped their entitlement years ago, and was a coward about the family dynamic for far too long. I wanted peace, but peace built on your invisible labor was a lie. I felt a tight knot in my chest, but I kept my face still and would not give them the satisfaction of a single tear. Ruth turned the page over. I knew what I was doing in October and knew they would try to corner me when I was weak. So I drove to Ruth's office and I signed my true will, clear-headed in the broad daylight, with federal witnesses watching, and did this so that no living soul could ever claim I did not mean every single word of it. Ruth paused, letting the silence amplify the incoming shockwave. Everything I personally own goes into an impenetrable trust that Evelyn controls. Not because she is my favorite granddaughter, but because she built that technology empire with me, line of code by line of code, ledger by ledger for the last 10 years. And the only thing I ever did wrong by her was allowing the rest of you arrogant fools to call it mine. Ruth finished the letter and set it down. She looked up at the room. Read the brushed steel plaque by the front door of the South Loop complex, Ruth said, delivering Arthur's final devastating blow. It was always true now, Ruth said, her tone shifting back to cold clinical precision. We move to the corporate assets, the part that Marcus and Clara understand least of all. Marcus gripped the edge of the desk. The tech division, the company Vance Tech and Logistics, Ruth stated loudly, is not a sole proprietorship. It never was. It is a limited liability company structured and filed in 2018. Ruth pulled a heavy-bound financial dossier from her desk and slid it forward. Arthur Vance held 45% of the corporate shares. That 45% now legally sits inside the trust that Evelyn Vance controls. The other 55%, Ruth looked at Marcus, her eyes gleaming with predatory finality, has belonged since the day the company was founded in 2018 exclusively to Evelyn Vance. She is, and she has always been, the majority owner, the CEO, and the ultimate authority of this $600 million corporation. Marcus's jaw actually dropped, the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. It's Arthur's company, it's a legacy firm, it's always been Arthur's. It is Evelyn's company, Ruth corrected him, slamming the dossier shut. And the 14 acres of prime commercial real estate in the South Loop. The land that the entire complex sits on. That deed is in Evelyn's name alone. It was recorded downtown 5 years ago. $8 at the county courthouse would have told any one of you who owned the ground you were walking on. Ruth leaned forward, resting her hands on the desk. That 55% equity and that 14-acre estate were never Arthur's to give to anyone. Not in October, not in November, not ever. The fraudulent paper you carried to his deathbed was a pathetic fight over assets he didn't even control. She looked around the room, her gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of the family. Under the October will, Arthur's minority shares pass into Evelyn's trust. Therefore, Clara inherits no part of the estate. Marcus inherits no executive control of the company. Clara exploded out of her chair. The sophisticated facade was gone. She was a cornered, feral animal facing total financial annihilation. This is insane, Clara screamed, her voice echoing violently off the mahogany panels. She's a sociopath. She isolated a dying man and stole everything. We will sue, Marcus, tell them. Tell them we are bringing in a federal litigation team. We will tie this up in court for decades. A 32-year-old woman in a charcoal suit, holding a blank portfolio. The entire room immediately fell silent and turned to face me. I did not raise my voice or need to, and spoke with the chilling absolute authority of a woman who holds every single card in the deck. Clara, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. Sit down. She looked at me, her chest heaving, her eyes wild. But she sat even now in the face of total ruin. My quiet authority worked where all her screaming never could. You can keep using the word family as a weapon, I said, my gaze sweeping across Aunt Margaret and the cousins. Use it as much as you like, but you will not be keeping the logistics company, you will not be keeping the tech division, and you will not be setting foot on my 14-acre estate ever again. None of it was ever on the table for you to take, you simply lacked the intelligence to look at the table you were trying to steal from. I turned my attention to Marcus. He flinched visibly. Marcus, I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. I ran a deep-tier forensic audit on the primary corporate accounts yesterday morning. His eyes widened in sheer unadulterated terror. He knew what was coming, that $4.8 million mezzanine loan you took out in September. I said, watching his soul leave his body. The one you secured from that syndicate of private equity lenders. The one you illegally listed my commercial real estate as collateral for. The one you convinced my sister to co-sign. Clara whipped her head around to look at her husband. Marcus, what is she talking about? What loan? That debt is yours, Marcus, I said, ignoring Clara's panic. Yours and Clara's, your names are on the note. Not one single dollar of that toxic debt touches my company. You illegally borrowed against an empire that was never going to be yours, Marcus. Clara shrieked, grabbing his arm. Tell me she's lying. Tell me you didn't leverage us for $5 million. Marcus stared at the floor, a broken, ruined man. I picked up my black leather portfolio. I adjusted the vintage Patek Philippe on my wrist. If the lenders come looking for their collateral, I said, delivering the final fatal blow, you can give them the address of your country club. Because if they step one foot onto my property, my corporate security team will have them arrested for trespassing, right after I hand over the forged documents to the FBI for federal wire fraud. I turned, and for the very first time in my entire life, I walked toward the front of the room and walked past Aunt Margaret, who was staring at me with a mixture of terror and awe. I walked past Marcus, who was hyperventilating into his hands, and walked past Clara, whose screams of fury had dissolved into hysterical, broken sobbing. I did not stop or look back and did not offer a single word of comfort, forgiveness, or compromise. I opened the heavy oak door and walked out into the bright, bustling, endless possibilities of a Tuesday morning in Chicago, and did not win with anger or win by screaming or begging for the respect I was owed. I never once raised my voice above the calm, measured tone I use at a corporate boardroom table, and one with encrypted ledgers, with flawless federal signatures, with forensic accounting, and with a grandfather who loved me enough to orchestrate the entire flawless trap in the broad daylight. The aftermath of the explosion was significantly quieter than you might expect. Most things are when the financial and legal paperwork underneath them is utterly impenetrable. The fraudulent bedside will was immediately withdrawn. Ruth Avery's office made certain it never even reached a preliminary courtroom hearing. Clara hired an aggressive, expensive defense attorney. He reviewed the documents, charged her a massive retainer, and told her what Ruth had already stated. A will signed by a drugged man, witnessed exclusively by the people trying to steal the assets, is a guaranteed loss. He also explicitly warned her that pressing the issue in court would instantly expose her and Marcus to criminal charges for elder fraud and coercion. She dropped the challenge within a week. The $4.8 million shadow loan stayed where it belonged. On Marcus, on Clara, personally and irrevocably, my tech empire never owed a single cent of it. Marcus's boutique investment firm, Crestview Capital, collapsed into total bankruptcy by the spring. The private equity syndicate seized their expensive cars, their summer home, and eventually, their primary residence. Clara was forced to resign from her elite country club boards. I did not lend them a single dime or answer their desperate weeping voicemails. And I sleep flawlessly every single night. The brushed steel plaque by the main entrance still reads E. and A. Vance, founded 2018, and lately the board members, the suppliers, and the industry rivals have actually started to read it. We've already decided what happens to his estate. That was the arrogant, toxic phrase Clara kept whispering over the casket, in my kitchen, like it was a settled, undeniable law of the universe. They had already decided and simply lacked the intelligence to realize they had decided wrong. Patience is not surrender, silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is simply the cold, terrifying sound a brilliant woman makes while she builds the trap, arms the mechanism, and waits for the truth to arrive on federal paper. That is my story, one arrogant whisper at a funeral, one cream-colored envelope marked October, and one quiet, brilliant woman they all made the fatal mistake of underestimating. If this story nudged you to finally stand up to the toxic people in your own life or to secure your own empire in the dark, take that as your sign. Do not scream, do not argue, document everything, build your leverage, and let the paperwork do the executing. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.